colonists resist tighter control. American colonists enjoyed a large degree of self-government. They were proud of their rights and loyal to the British monarch King George III, but the French and Indian War strained their loyalty. In 1763, Britain controlled almost all of North America east of the Mississippi River. This enormous territory promised endless room for settlement. However, Native Americans living west of the Appalachian Mountains were desperately trying to keep their lands. Fighting between Native Americans and white settlers began as soon as the French and Indian War ended. In the last days of the French and Indian War, the leader of the Ottawa Nation, Pontiac, formed an alliance of Western Native Americans. In May 1763, Pontiac and his allies attacked British forts and settlements throughout the area. Nearly half a dozen Western British forts were destroyed, and at least 2,000 backcountry settlers were killed. British settlers reacted with equal violence. They killed Native Americans who had not attacked them. The British finally defeated Pontiac's forces in early August at a battle near Fort Pitt. Pontiac continued to fight for another year, but by the fall of 1764, Pontiac's war was over. The Proclamation of 1763. Britain wanted to avoid further wars with Native Americans after the war with Pontiac. Therefore, the British government issued the Proclamation of 1763. It banned colonial settlement west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains. Settlers were told they had to move to a location east of that line. The Proclamation of 1763 angered many colonists. The colonists were proud of their contribution toward winning the French and Indian War. Tens of thousands of men had served as soldiers, and many had died in the war. Therefore, the colonists believed they had a right to reside or live wherever they wanted. The proclamation was widely ignored and proved impossible for the British to enforce. Although ties between the colonies had begun to grow before the French and Indian War, the 13 colonies still were divided in many ways. But the people of those colonies also saw themselves as different from the people living in Britain. In 1763, the colonists still considered themselves loyal British subjects. Increasingly, however, they identified more with one another than with those in Britain. The British saw things differently. The French and Indian War had left Britain deeply in debt. Furthermore, these expenses continued. The British government had to keep troops in North America to make sure France did not try to regain its lost territory, and to also protect the settlers against Native American attacks. British leaders believed the colonists should pay part of the debt. The British effort to impose new taxes on the colonies began in 1764, when Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which put a duty or import tax on several products, including molasses. It also called for harsh punishment of smugglers. Colonial merchants who sometimes traded in smuggled goods protested. 1 year later, Parliament passed the Quartering Act. The purpose of the Quartering Act was to save money. To enforce the proclamation of 1763, Britain kept about 10,000 soldiers in the colonies. The act required colonists to quarter or house British troops and provide them with food and other supplies. The colonists protested angrily. Once again, the colonists complained that Parliament was violating their rights. An even more unpopular law was the Stamp Act, passed by Parliament in early 1765. The Stamp Act required that all colonists buy special tax stamps for all kinds of products and activities. The stamps had to be placed on all paper products, including newspapers, wills, licenses, insurance policies, land titles, and contracts. Protests against the Stamp Act were widespread. Patrick Henry, one of the youngest members of the Virginia House of Burgesses, made an emotional speech attacking the law. Henry ended his speech with a reference to the murder of Julius Caesar in ancient Rome. When Henry said that some good American would do the same to King George III, cries of treason were hurled against him. Henry replied, "If this be treason, make the most of it." Other colonial assemblies followed Virginia's example. Merchants in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia organized boycotts. A boycott is an organized campaign to refuse to buy certain products. The protest spread to every colony. In October, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York for the Stamp Act Congress. They sent a petition, a written request to the government, addressed to the King and Parliament. This petition demanded the end of both the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. The protest worked. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act.